Well, Professor Davis, thank you for agreeing one more time to participate in our disaster discussions on a topic that I'm really looking forward to hearing you discuss, which is the people who inspired you.
Well, I'm very pleased to be here, David, and it's a great pleasure to talk to you about these different topics.
Okay, I'm going to share screen now so we can go into your presentation. There we go.
Well, today I want to just have a discussion about some of the people who really inspired me over the years and reflect on some of their ideas, which have been not just helpful, but again, inspirational. Next, please. It's very hard to choose people who have helped you or you admire or have been supportive because there's hundreds of them, really hundreds. But I've just selected a few from the disaster risk and recovery field and a few who've been especially helpful in my own specialization, which has largely been on shelter and settlement issues. And they come from different countries. There are rather more coming from Europe and North America than perhaps are reflected in this list, because I've been helped enormously by all sorts of people in developing countries, having visited about 45 countries in my work. But I'll just go through some of these and share some of the insights that I've had from them. Thank you. Next. Bernard of Chartres, who was a 12th century monk, he wrote a very famous book, and I love the quote from it. We're all like dwarfs on the shoulders of giants, so that we can see more than they, and things at a greater distance, not by virtue of any sharpness of sight on our part or any physical distinction, but because we're carried high and raised up by their giant size. He's basically saying, he's been quite humble. We're quite small, but we base our work on giants. And this quote was picked up by Isaac Newton, who repeated it, and various people over the years have repeated this, and I'm simply repeating it because it was important. Oh, David, I better just deal with this phone. Sorry, my wife's taken it. It's fine. Better do that again, had I? Where that phone interrupted.
Just go ahead. That's fine.
So I want to just reflect on how this quote here has related to my own work as I have listened to other people's insights. Next, please. So first of all, then, a few people from the disaster risk and recovery field. Next, please. Sometimes the insight comes from quite an unexpected source, and one that you're just not expecting. And it might have been an isolated intervention which happened once and never again. And just after I began leading disaster management courses in 1983, we had an international program and various people came from many countries. We had a large number of people coming because there weren't many courses like this anywhere. And one year we had some people from Jamaica with us. And I was always a bit of a loss as to who to get to come and talk, but I invited somebody from the Red Cross to come and give a presentation. And he came from Geneva to help me. And he gave a talk on disaster recovery. And during the course of this presentation, he put up on the screen an overhead projector foil, and he said the aim of disaster recovery is to restore normality. Well, I didn't pick up much about this, I just heard it, but it resulted in a fantastic outburst from the back of the room, where somebody called Wynant Patterson, she was a senior nurse from Jamaica, and she had extensive disaster experience. Next, please. And she called out, literally called out, and I wrote down what she said afterwards because it struck me very forcefully. "May I protest," she said. "Please do not use that slide ever again. You're stating that the aim of disaster recovery is to return to the status quo, but that must be fundamentally wrong. In the city where I live, Kingston, Jamaica, we have people living in cardboard boxes. So are you seriously suggesting that after a future hurricane or earthquake in Kingston, we need to rehouse them back in these boxes? Long pause. Then she shouted out, banging the table, "No, sir. Any recovery must move forward to a better and safer future, since normality equals vulnerability." Well, this was a remarkable, I thought, because she absolutely nailed him, and she showed that recovery has to move forward, and it can't simply be restoring normality, because normality, as she quite rightly said, was what gave rise to the disaster. So I've always, from there on, I listened very, very hard to people coming on our workshops, because whether it would be a chance conversation on a field visit, or whether it was something they wrote or something they said in a group session, all sorts of nuggets of truth were coming from them. And this was a particularly memorable one. So I really was inspired by Wynand Patterson. Next, please. I don't think I ever met this man, Adolf Chiborowski. He's a Polish architect planner. He was born in 1919, and when the Second World War was about to break out, he was a senior architectural student in Warsaw. He, with colleagues, felt that the city of Warsaw was going to be devastated in bombing at some point or other. They feared it from Russia, they feared it from Germany, they weren't sure where it was going to come from. So they decided that one day Warsaw would have to be rebuilt. This was extraordinary. This was before any bombs had landed. And they went out at night with flashlights and they did measured drawings of the buildings. And they measured the details and took careful measurements of whatever they felt were the key buildings, and they collected them and assembled them, and they hid them because they thought that one day Warsaw would be rebuilt. And these drawings would help whoever it was that was in charge of reconstruction. Well, Warsaw was devastated in the war, and many of these buildings that Adolf and his fellow students measured were destroyed. Later on, he didn't realize it, but he was going to become the director of reconstruction in Warsaw. So he went to the secret place where they'd hidden the drawings, and they used them in rebuilding buildings. Remarkable example of foresight and care for a community. He went on to be in charge of reconstruction in Hanover and also in Skopje, Yugoslavia, which was devastated in an earthquake in 1963. And I just really admired Chiborowski. He became a very well-known UN planner and wrote some very important books, which I treasure. And he did some remarkable urban planning for Skopje, some of the first earthquake flood resistant urban planning in Europe. Next, please. And then I came across George Nez. He's a US urban planner. He lives in Denver, Colorado, and he was called upon to direct reconstruction programs in many, many post-earthquake situations, working for the World Bank, working for the American government, working for national governments. And I really liked what he was writing, so much so that I wrote to him and said, "I'd really like to talk to you, but I live in England." And he said, "Well, when you're next in the US, come to Denver and we'll meet," which is what I did. And I was in New York, and I flew all the way to Denver, Colorado to meet him. And we had a very good chat in the hotel, and he told me all manner of things. And when I left, he sent me a letter, and the letter captured what he'd been talking about in our meeting, and I used it in my PhD. I'll just read a bit of it. "Whenever you direct a reconstruction program, everyone blames the disaster for this or that problem. However, gradually you come to realize that 90% of the problems you encounter, they were all present long before the disaster. They were just waiting to be tackled." Next, please. "All that has happened is that the disaster has acted like a surgeon's scalpel. that has been used to expose all manner of weakness and failure, such as poor government. Then he went on to list all these different things: unenforced building codes, lack of planning, corruption in all directions, etc. And then he finished the letter by saying the issue poses a dilemma concerning how far it's possible to go with limited resources at your disposal in addressing the residual weakness in a society as well as reconstructing its towns and cities. He highlights a really interesting issue, and that is that disasters expose weakness. Always they expose weakness. It might be administrative weakness, it might be structural weakness, it might be weakness in emergency services, it might be all manner of weaknesses. And the reconstruction people, the recovery people, have got to decide which of these they are able to tackle, which of these they have the money to tackle. And it results in a very careful, difficult process of selection. I really value George Ness's insight. Next, please. And dear Henry Quarantelli, he became a very close friend. He died about 4 or 5 years ago. He was one of the leading sociologists in the world to look at disasters from the 1950s onwards. He was a social scientist, and with Russell Dines, they formed something called the Disaster Research Center in Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio, and later on it moved to University of Delaware. When I began my research, I was sent by my supervisor to the first major disaster. I didn't know how on earth I'd cope with that because I knew nothing. I was absolutely ignorant. And then I came across the work of Quarantelli, who'd been working in social science research since the late 50s. So I was now in 1972, and he'd been working on this for at least 15 years. And I'd read some of his writings, although it wasn't easy because there wasn't much in Britain from his books at that point. So I asked if I could meet him, and I flew to Columbus, Ohio, and I met Henry and Russell and their colleagues, and they were unbelievably generous. In fact, it gave me a huge lesson in talking to students who come and see me, because I've often been a bit abrupt when they come along uninvited or unexpected, and they want help, and I haven't had the time to give it to them, but he gave me loads of time. He even took me to the airport when I left to fly down to Nicaragua, and as we were in the departure lounge, he said to me, "Well, I hope you get on well, Ian." And then he said this to me: "When you arrive in Managua to study the earthquake, you'll become aware there's been a massive overestimate of damage and dislocation, and an equally massive underestimate of local resources to cope with the situation." Well, I digested that and I said, "How do you know? Have you been there?" He said, "No, of course I haven't." I said, "Well, how do you know that's likely to be the case?" He said, "Because I've studied disasters since the 1950s, and this has been the pattern in every one, regardless whether they were earthquakes or floods or whatever." He said, "This is a standard pattern, and I don't see why it would be any different in Nicaragua." Well, I thought that's interesting. So, an overestimate of damage and massive underestimate of resources. I said, why is that? He said, "Well, you're the student. You better tell me." So here we were at the departure gate having a kind of key tutorial. It was extraordinary. There were public address announcements coming in, all the rest of it. I said, "Well, is this because the media has exaggerated the problem?" He said, "Yes, keep going." I said, "Is it because the agencies are trying to attract more help and support?" "Yes, keep going." And we went on like this. And so when I got to Nicaragua, I had in my head this kind of assumption: the problem I'm looking at has been overestimated, and there's been a massive underestimate of how local people or local resources are dealing with it. And he was absolutely spot on. And I learned so much then about capacities, and always to look for local capacities in sorting out problems. A capacity might be local knowledge, it might be money, it might be local expertise, it might be a brilliant leader, it might be an NGO, it might be a priest or a headmaster or a headmistress, all sorts of things. Next, please. Here are some of the capacities that we came to think about: memories of past events, volunteers, cash reserves, local leadership, use of families as host families, and so on. And gradually, I began to realize that sheltering was more important than shelters. People were sheltered with all sorts of other people, and they didn't necessarily need a little shelter that some fancy architect might design. Next, please. Nick Ambrases, well, he was a colossal help. He's an engineering seismologist from Greece. He speaks 8 languages, or spoke 8 languages. He was an archaeologist, a historian, a linguist, an engineer, and a seismologist, like a universal man. He wanted to find out a map of Turkey to show earthquake incidents. And so he studied things like coins being issued by Roman authorities to raise money following an earthquake, because there was no evidence of any earthquake in the ground around a given place. But he found that if there were coins being issued, there must have been earthquakes. He was compiling earthquake maps based on historical information, not geological information. And he applied that right through the Middle East and wrote some of the most remarkable earthquake analyses and maps in his work. And he was heavily involved in the reconstruction of Skopje after the earthquake. And I met him quite early on, and he was so helpful. Whenever I had a problem, I'd go and see him, and he spent hours with me and guided us in all sorts of projects we were doing. After the Guatemala earthquake of 1976, we had a Royal Society meeting in London, and he came, and so did Henry Quarantelli, and various people came over for it. And Nick Ambrases said this in the beginning of his talk: today's act of God, what has happened in Nicaragua with 23,000 deaths, is likely to be regarded as tomorrow's act of criminal negligence. Well, that really got me. I thought, well, we no longer believe disasters were acts of God, but he's saying people are going to get locked up. There's going to be prisons with people in them who've caused these problems. And he's quite right. And there are people now in prison, architects and engineers in many countries. And in China, it is believed that at least a dozen engineers were executed following the earthquake in Sichuan. It happened in 2010 in Xinjiang. Sorry, and so Nick Ambrases, next please. He went on to look at what was happening, and he worked with Roger Billum, one of America's leading seismologists. And they then did something very clever. They looked at the earthquake records, and they looked at who had died in earthquakes. And they started to correlate it with what was coming out of a German-based NGO called Transparency International, who were looking at levels of corruption in the world. And they started to look to see which countries and which areas had been designated as most corrupt. And they came to the conclusion in a remarkable paper, which I've listed here in Nature, that 83%, they believe, of all deaths over a 30-year period was a result of some form of corruption. So he was then beginning to prove that the human factors, of course, it was difficult to make this correlation, and we challenged him about that. But basically, they were laying down the foundation for a new area of inquiry. Next, please. And we began to realize that preventing corruption could involve education, public awareness, developing standards, a whole range of anti-corruption methods like small projects and better tendering procedures, developing accountability. One crucial thing was to pay proper wages to enforcement officers, because many countries paid them pittances because they knew that they took bribes to supplement their incomes. So until you pay enforcement officers and police proper wages, they will take bribes. And so that was a key factor. And we believe governments always had to set an example. And alliances were needed in any country between religious bodies, people concerned about ethical behavior, and civil society in campaigns to try and prevent corruption. Next, please. Gilbert White. well, he's the great father of hazard research. He was a remarkable man, a peace-loving Quaker, a geographer, advisor to Roosevelt before World War II on floodplain management. And he developed the first floodplain management system, I believe, in the world in Boulder, Colorado. And these are just a couple of his quotes. The construction of protection works has frequently been a signal for accelerated movement into a floodplain. He's highlighted a really big issue there. If you make a place safe, it becomes a magnet. People move there and put themselves at risk. What a big dilemma, what a big issue that is. And he said floods are acts of God, but flood losses are largely acts of man. Well, I think we might question floods being acts of God. We could very much highlight the human factors in it. I met Gilbert on a number of occasions. Lastly, I think in 1998 in Colorado, and I was very, very fond of him. He was a man of high integrity, and it was a joy to talk to him about his passion, which was water. Before he got involved in flooding, it was water, getting water to people and protection of water sources and so on. But a remarkable hero figure and one of the great fathers of disaster risk management. Next, please. Terry Jagle, somebody you know as well, David. And when I first met you, I met Terry at the same time. I had met him before. Absolutely delightful person. And tragically, he died prematurely, I believe, just 3 years ago. Always enthusiastic, always searching for new ideas. And unlike so many UN bureaucrats, who, when people go into the UN, it often destroys their creativity and enthusiasm for life, and they have to get smothered by the bureaucracy, which is so heavy. But he had to cope with this bureaucracy and did it triumphantly and managed to triumph above it and kept his curiosity, his enthusiasm for the subject and for life, despite being a very high ranking official in various UN agencies. He was wise, he was pragmatic and generous, and he could operate with people in a workshop. We had a wonderful workshop in in Japan, in about 2018, and Terry was just wonderful in it with everybody. Next, please. And he had various quotes. He often spoke about what lessons need to be learned. Temporary shelters are often an expedient and expensive mistake. Schools should be made safer. People live by the sea don't understand tsunamis adequately, etc. He would go through various lessons and write them into his articles and talks. What a loss, dear Terry, leaving us. But he was a great giant and one of the many giants on whose shoulders I sat. Next, please. And a few people from the shelter and settlement field. I'll just run through a few of them as well in this gallery, next please, of giants. My supervisor in my research was a German Jewish urban planner. His father was chief engineer in Berlin during the years before the Second World War, and he got out because he knew what was going to happen to Jewish people under Nazi oppression. And Otto came with him with a degree already in architecture from Berlin and also in archaeology. And Otto didn't like the anti-Semitism he found in Britain, tragically still there in many places, and went to India, where he became eventually director of housing. When India became independent, he was advising Nehru on housing policy for the whole country. He must have decided to come back to England. I can't think quite why, but he came back and he became the head of the School of Tropical Architecture in the Architecture Association. And then he began to run a new organization called Development Planning Unit in University College. And that's where I met him and I became his student while I was doing my PhD. he got very interested in what I was doing. He was very blunt about what I should do and what I shouldn't do. He was very worried that I go to places and design things. He said, as an architect, there is a design problem, but it's not your problem. Just got to listen and learn and keep your mouth shut. And then he wrote a letter to me in 1978, and he said, you've got to remember, Ian, that the relief is the enemy of recovery. Wow. What was a relief to me was the Mother Teresa and being kind and the Good Samaritan and all these things of helping people. The idea this was an enemy, relief being an enemy, that was strange. You've got to minimize relief, he said, to maximize recovery. Avoid dependency at all times and take your lead from survivors. You must not do anything that survivors can do themselves. Well, that was revolutionary to me and absolutely fundamental, and became the key foundation of my PhD. How to minimize relief and maximize recovery, how to avoid paternalism, how to help people to help themselves. Wonderful examples from Otto. Next, please. And so what he was basically saying is that in this graph, that the relief bit at the beginning, the little first of these little arcs, there is a huge need there for money and an expertise and everything, but in fact the problem has not yet grown. Relief is the enemy of reconstruction, because in that first little arc, a lot of money comes and a lot of expertise comes, but you're going to need it later on. And so as the disaster recovery progresses, there's often a decline of money and a decline of resources just when you need it. And so he's saying relief is the enemy of reconstruction, and he's absolutely spot on. And I kept on, it shows the need for rapid reconstruction and shows the need for better structuring of support for recovery and reconstruction. Next, please. Let's go back one. This was, sorry, just carry on. Sorry, one more, David, thank you. This was the advice he gave me, Otto, in 72. Keep my mouth shut, keep my ears open, keep my eyes open, and promise not to design anything, but observe the design process at work. I think it's just a reminder of listening to people and never confusing lack of education with lack of intelligence. As I've met so many wise and wonderful people who might never have had any education when I've traveled. Never make any assumptions like that. Next, please. Fred Cuny, a brash Texan urban planner who had been working in disasters in Biafra during the Civil War. He had his own plane and he flew around in different disasters, and he had his own company called Intertect. He was the opposite of a kind of considered measured academic, a very brash character who rubbed up all officials wherever he went. But my goodness, he knew a lot. And when I was working in shelter, I suddenly became aware of Fred's work. He was quite a bit younger than I was. I mean, 7 years younger. But nevertheless extraordinarily knowledgeable. And he had the highest possible opinion of himself. This was part of his brashness. He'd go into a course in Wisconsin where we were leading a course for training of trainers. Hi, everybody. My name is Fred Cuny. I'm the leading disaster practitioner in the world. Wow. So listen very hard to what I've got to teach you. I mean, these were extraordinary claims. And I doubt if it's true, but he nevertheless grabbed people's attention by this kind of arrogance. And next, please. And Fred went on to become a very important figure. And he has a quote here about attending to the horizontal linkages between organizations and not just the vertical linkages of accountability and management. He was murdered in Chechnya following work that he was doing for the Soros Foundation in the early 90s, and that was a terrible loss. There was a suggestion he was doing some spying work for the Americans. I doubt that, but he was certainly a target of the terrorists who regarded him as something of some imperialistic intervention or something. And it was a tragedy that he was killed. He was a dear friend, and I was greatly indebted to him in all the work we did on shelter. Next, please. And a colleague I worked with for since 1976, right up to his death in 2017, a dear friend, a brilliant man who's a world authority on vernacular architecture, and he was a world authority in the history of blues music. Paul was one of those characters of infectious enthusiasm for everything. And he and I worked together in our shelter projects in Brooks, and it was due to him that we managed to make an impact, because he was the deputy head of the school and gave us great protection and support. In one of the papers he wrote, he asserted his knowledge, because he was an anthropologist by background. A lovely quote: "A town's made of buildings, but a community is made of people. A house is a structure, but a home is much more. The distinctions are not trivial, nor are they sentimental or romantic. They're fundamental to understanding the difference between the provision of shelter which serves to protect and the creation of domestic environments that express the deep structures of society." Trying to distinguish between the physical house and the emotional home was quite crucial, and that still is crucial. And in most languages in the world, you've got different words for house and home. And we've been asserting that difference in all our work on shelter. Next, please. And these are just examples of a little house in Haiti, which people have crammed into it all of their belongings, and they're trying to survive in this little temporary structure while they get ready for the next move. We just go back, I think, on the last one. We might have just missed one there, David. No, it's the one after, sorry, it's the one after this. And here's an example of somebody who's added a porch to their prefab in Italy. They were given a prefab to live in, but it was cold, and so they built a little porch and they made it ornamental. They've added ornamental details like the gate with a little arch above it. They're personalizing it. They're making this house into a home. This is this transformation of something. Sorry about the telephone. Next, please. And Paul's work reminded me of Mark Twain, who once wrote this famous saying: "A man's house burns down. The smoking wreckage represents only a ruined home that was dear through years of use and pleasant association. By and by, as the days and weeks go on, he misses this, then that, and then the other thing. And then he casts about it, for he finds that it was that house. Always it is an essential. There was always but one of its kind. It cannot be replaced. It was in that house. It's irrevocably lost. It will be years before the tale of lost essentials is complete. And not till then can he truly know the magnitude of his disaster." What Mark Twain was coming at was that houses are crucial for a person's identity and final recovery. Lovely quote, reminding me of Paul Oliver. Next, please. Mihir Bhatt, an Indian planner who founded the All India Disaster Mitigation Institute in Ahmedabad. He's a dynamic character. His mother is one of the leading development workers in India. She's part of the group that Jimmy Carter assembled called the Elders, where they go and do conflict resolution internationally. So having a very famous mother who's known all over India for her work on women's development, he still battled on his own right to form this organization. And he has a wonderful grasp of opportunities. Mihir's patient, he's sensitive, he has great empathy with disaster survivors and the vulnerable poor. I said 10 vulnerable poor, I meant the vulnerable poor. I worked with him in several evaluations, and he sat cross-legged in villages, interrogating local farmers and children, finding out in all the languages he spoke, which is many, what went on in their lives and how they behaved. And I was with him once in a meeting in Bangkok, and he said, you know, we should go back to that place in Maharashtra and see what happened 15 years ago. And I said, I'd love to do that. He says, well, let's go. I said, I don't know if I can, where I can raise the money. He said, you need money. I said, no, just a flight. He said, that's not a problem. You'll get that easily, but let's go. And we went back, and wow, what we learnt on that visit. Wonderful to go back and see what took place in a given place and find out that all the things that we couldn't understand were being resolved. And it was very positive recovery. Next, please. Mihir does remarkable things, and one example of it is an insurance scheme he set up for very poor people. So he takes these clients, as he calls them, people with an annual income of about $350 to $500. Repeat that, an annual income of $350 to $500. And they own micro businesses. They might sell tailoring services in the market, or they might sell pomegranates or mangoes. And in exchange for a one-time upfront fee, which is worth about 3 days of their salary, this organization provide coverage for loss of damage to their house or stock in trade, in case they lose their sewing machine or something, or loss of work. So he's providing an insurance scheme to protect some of the poorest people in Gujarat. So far, he's got 3,700 clients. And these 3,700 are now being protected by this micro insurance scheme. And it's a typical example of his trying to look in the cracks of how you can help things. Wonderful giant I learned from. Next, please. I'm nearly at the end of these. I just want to refer to dear Maggie Stevenson. She's a close friend, and she is an architect from Dublin in Ireland. When she finished her graduation in studies in Dublin, she went to work for the city of Dublin, and she began to understand how cities work and how housing authorities in cities work. And she got very involved in housing policy and housing finance and housing law. And then she got involved in disasters, and she started to apply what she learned in disasters. And the result is that she became a quite different kind of animal that I'd never come across before. She was planted by UN Habitat in the government of Pakistan, or in the government of Nepal, or the government of Lebanon, or the government of Haiti. So she goes along with her lovely Irish lilting accent and her friendly way with people, and she just sits in the back of the room and just listens and learns, tries to pick up their language if she needs it, and helps and provides a bit of advice. And this was quite a new, unique form of support and brilliantly successful. And she was responsible for a vast housing project in Pakistan, where about 600,000 houses were built using an owner building approach. And this was all due to Maggie's insight. She wrote to me some time ago, and she said, keep watching, keep listening, keep trying to understand and be relevant. And she said, Ian, you're getting older, but remain ambitious. Be ambitious for others. Enable your ambitions. Build collective purpose. Leave no one behind. Be nimble, not intrusive or oppressive. Fast and smart. Skillful and respectful. Next, please. And she developed a diagram, and I'm not going to dwell on it, but one end of the diagram on the left is process and the other side is product. And she's saying, we've got to move away from provision, the right hand, to the left hand. Instead of giving people a house, give them cash so they can build a house if they want it with technical support. We don't have to decide what they should have. Let them assess their own needs, provide support, be more developmental, put less emphasis on the supply issue, but on the demand issue. So she's trying to reverse the way things are done. And she's been brilliantly successful. And now apart from Maggie's work, but many others have been advocating cash support for disaster victims, and they've won. and now cash support has become the norm in the last 15 years compared to provision of goods in the past. Next, please. So this is something that she's always been keen on. She's now working in Nepal as she finalizes her PhD, and somebody's written about her. Nepal is going to take, this is something that she's actually written herself. Nepal is going to take at least a decade to recover. Anywhere in the world would take that long to recover from such a major crisis, and it requires a different kind of help. There are lots of supporters involved in Nepal, but it's not just a question of assisting the most vulnerable. It's about being strategic. And here she captures the essence of her work, supporting local systems and effecting large-scale impacts for recovery. She's always tried to support locals and local systems and help those local systems. Next, please. Therefore, my last picture. As I think about these giants, I've got to be willing to listen and learn from others. I've got to put down on record what I've learned and shared it with others. When I heard Wynand Patterson talk about disaster recovery, I was fortunate to write it down. I remembered it. I've got to look out for people in different occupations and professions. If I'm an architect, I've got to talk to geographers. I've got to talk to nurses. I've got to talk to anthropologists. And they've got to talk to me. We've got to move between professions and different levels. I've got to talk to postmen and school teachers and priests and rabbis and different people. I've got to get to know and meet people from different backgrounds. I've got to cultivate networks. And with Google's help, I've got to take advantage of podcasts like TED Talks. I've got to keep asking questions. I've got to listen. And I must never disregard a request to share my experiences or ideas. I've got to avoid complacency, and I've got to keep searching. I feel deeply indebted to all these giants who helped me in my career. And I just would encourage everyone to see who are your giants and what can you learn from them. Thank you very much indeed, David. Really enjoyed talking to you.
Ian, that was just fascinating. I can't tell you how much I enjoyed that. As you were talking, I had some thoughts and remembrances as well. When you were talking about how disasters sort of expose aspects of vulnerability in society, for example, it really made me think of Eric Klinenberg's book on the Chicago heat wave and the phrase social autopsy that's sometimes used. And disasters, in a sense, are a kind of social autopsy. Do you agree with that?
Yes, very much so. I think that we can learn so much from them, and we can, and also in a sense, they are going to be agents of change. I'm sure after that Chicago heat wave, there were changes. There were huge changes in Britain after all of our great smogs, which killed people, and we had a Clean Air Act, and so you started to see the sunshine in London, and the autopsy was the analysis of what went wrong, and we're going to get that after COVID. So I would totally agree with him. I think that's really very important.
Yeah. Sometimes we really learn from events, and sometimes we don't seem to learn so well. We've had actually a terrible heat wave in Western Canada with temperatures, just high-time record temperatures just being smashed.
Yes.
And the heat wave, and now there are forest fires, and there's going to be all kinds of impacts happening after it. I was just talking with Laurie Pierce a few days ago, and she made the comment that in British Columbia, the number of excess deaths that they found so far from it was up around 700 or 800, like many hundreds of people. And she made the comment, we just hadn't, the lessons that we should have learned from like the Chicago heat wave and other heat waves just hadn't been properly translated into policy in British Columbia, and that we just hadn't done a good job at that. And sometimes we learn and implement what we've learned, and sometimes we don't. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on what differentiates those two directions.
Yes, I've always been very sad to see how when there'd been big lessons learned in one situation, how even in the same country, they don't necessarily get transferred. So I was really encouraged when I went to Sendai in Japan after the tsunami to meet various officials, and I said to them, you've developed some very innovative projects here, and have you learned from what happened in Kobe in 1995 when they had an earthquake? He said, yes, we have, because the Kobe government from the Hyogo prefecture sent up the people who'd worked on there, and they talked to us about it, and we built it into our policies. And that was really commendable. Then I heard that the World Bank took a coach load of public officials from India from a drought from a flood-prone area and moved them to another state to do the same process. So suddenly people are beginning to realize that you can move knowledge around, and people are very willing to listen and learn when something happens. So I think it's something to be worked on. I've often been perplexed to arrive in a place and tell people things which I thought they would know, but they don't necessarily know. Um, Knowledge transfers is quite complicated. For example, we went to India when I was working as an architect, and we helped people build houses after a tropical cyclone. And they were bamboo houses, and we put in triangulation into the walls. So you've got a wooden frame, and you put an angle piece right across the angle to take out the risk of it collapsing. And then you put another diagonal across the roof, a horizontal one, to take out other forces. And you can see that in scaffolding on any structure, these diagonal lines of scaffolding which are there for that purpose. Now, I think anyone who's grown up in the Boy Scouts or movement or whatever knows about guy ropes, and they're used to this kind of process. So this is basic bushcraft in many societies. Things children do, but in India, we weren't sure if people knew about this. And sure enough, we went back 5 years later, and all the diagonal wood had been taken out, and these structures were leaning over. And we said to the people, why when you came here, was there a diagonal piece of wood? They said yes, but it wasn't doing anything. We said, what do you mean it wasn't doing anything? He said, it was just unnecessary, so we burnt it as firewood. I said it was doing something. It was stopping the building from falling over. And then at that point, we did a little demonstration for them and showed them how the diagonal little model would take out that flexing. And they were very interested in that. And this was the first time anybody had ever explained that to them. It taught me a big lesson, and that is that when you set up an education program for builders, you've got to also set up an education program for users and occupants. It's not just the builders who matter, because the builders have gone when somebody's living in the house, and if they don't know why it is the way it is, they'll do it. They won't understand why it's being created that way. So that was a big lesson. But I don't know how. We just have to keep on the issue of writing things down. Um, and I think in the internet age, there is a tendency not to write things down and not to store things, to think that you can store things electronically. Well, there's big risks in that. Stuff can get lost very easily, and people lose their hard drives or people lose the memory stick. I'm a great believer in the printed word, and I'm a great believer in books still.
I can see that by your background.
Yeah, and I feel very, maybe it's a Luddite view of an old person, David, but I don't know how we can do things other than, well, what you're doing with these podcasts are very important. I mean, because they might help that process along. Somebody having seen this, what I've just done, might think, who are the people who've influenced me? I only ought to write to them and thank them, or I ought to just jot down what I'm learning from them. And I ought to try and think about who I'm influencing, and what that influence is, and whether it's for the good or bad. You know, I think we've got to think of ourselves as part of a chain, much more than as a part of an individual. And I think in our culture, there's a strong emphasis on individualism, and we should think more collectively. I think a good model for society is wire netting, where we're kind of connected all over the place. And the wire netting is strong because of its multiple connections. And for those of us working in disaster planning, we're connected to other academics, but we're connected to emergency planners, and we're connected to students, and we're connected to local residents and mayors and the political system. And those connections are all learning opportunities, and they're education opportunities in all directions, and we need to value it. I don't think we should think of ourselves as spokes of a wheel where we're at the beginning, in the middle, and they're radiating out all this knowledge. I think we should think of ourselves as interconnected in a lattice, or wire netting is a better model of that process.
That's a great image to, I think, end this interview with. And I like it very much. So Ian, I would like to thank you again for donating your time and
It's been a great pleasure.
yeah.
And I just want to wish you well, David, and wish all those who have seen this well in your jobs. And if you are interested in writing to me, I'd be very happy to hear from you. My email is ian.robert.davis, Davis, @gmail.com, and I will endeavour to reply to any message I get. I'll just repeat that: Ian, IAN, .robert, ROBERT, .davis, DAVIS, @gmail.com. I'll look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.